Welcome to Layer of the Alchemist, where we discuss all things heavy metal and hard rock. On today's episode, the Loudness Wars, dynamic range, why I don't like a lot of modern recordings. So, you've heard me talk about this in other videos, and this is a video that I've been meaning to make for a while. You'll hear me talk about the Loudness Wars, or a particular album being lacking in dynamic range or being harsh and fatiguing on the ears. So I wanted to make a video just talking more in detail about what I'm talking about when I talk about these things, dynamic range and the Loudness Wars. Now, I am not an audio engineer. I'm not an acoustic physicist, an acoustic alchemist. So this is just my interpretation of what these things are. I have read into these things, but I don't claim to be any kind of authority. I encourage people to Google Loudness Wars or dynamic range in modern recordings or something like that, and you'll find people that really go in depth on these subjects. So I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about my experience with it and some of my tips for not falling prey to this, not buying a recording that might be ruined because of these things. So, okay, how did let's talk about what the dynamic range is. So dynamic range on a recording is the difference between the loudest and the softest parts in the song. If you've listened to a classical album, an orchestra, think Beethoven, Mozart, whatever, those things get whisper quiet and then they get super loud. There's tons of dynamic range in classical recordings. Now in rock, there isn't as much dynamic range because rock tends to just be, rocking out, man. It's really just sort of, it's loud but there are times where there are contrasts. I just made a video, I don't know if it'll be up yet, on Scorpions, and I was talking about Still Loving You. That song gets really quiet and then it builds up and it gets really loud. So there's an example of dynamic range, and you can measure the amount of dynamic range in a particular song. So a classical recording could have 20 to 24 decibels of dynamic range in it. A good sounding rock recording might have 15, 16, 18 decibels of dynamic range in it. So what happened was when people used to record, I got my whiteboard here, I'm going to be using my whiteboard. When people used to record in the 70s and 80s, when you recorded, you had a sound wave. And a sound wave might look something like this. So you've got, let's just say this is a drum track. The drummer hits the snare drum. It's louder than the bass drum. Maybe this is like the ride cymbal. He hits the bass drum a little bit harder here, then he hit it here. So these are examples of what a sound wave looks like in dynamic range. So the ride cymbal is quieter than the snare drum. It makes sense, right? Well, when you recorded analog onto tape, and then tape was transferred to vinyl or cassette, you had let's just call this like the zero floor here. Anything above this, it distorts. So if a sound did go above that line, it might distort, but it was in a very analog type of way. It was a lot warmer, a lot more, it wasn't a harsh sounding kind of distortion, but in general, they kept everything below the line, the distortion line. Now, what happens, I'm going to try to erase my line here. So this line, hold on, I just dropped my marker. This line, the distortion line there, was, let's just describe it as a certain spot on your stereo. It produced, the whole recording then produced a certain amount of loudness. So when digital came around, what they started doing is they wanted to make everything louder. So in order to do that, if you just raise all this up louder, then this peak is really gonna, let's pretend like the black line up here is just where it'll start to distort. If we move everything up and stuff starts going way above this line, it's gonna be really harsh and ugly sounding. So what they started doing is they started chopping off. They used what's called a dynamic compressor, which chops off the highs and the lows. So you get this taken out, and you get some of the bottom taken out, and then you have what looks like at the top of the frequencies now is a hard, like brick-like line. Often you'll hear them use the expression brick-walled mastering. Well, that's because this is what happens when you cut the sound waves. Remember, this sound wave was way up here, and now we've cut it so that it's, doesn't have that same dynamic. So now, this was our bass drum before. This is our ride cymbal. Now, this was our snare drum, which was really loud, which before went all the way up to here. Well, we cut all that out. So now the snare drum doesn't pop and hit as much, and it's more on the same loudness level as the ride cymbal. So it crushes everything. And then what you land up, I'm dropping all my stuff here. What it lands up looking like, and this is where it just starts to look like a brick wall with some little peaks and valleys in it. And then that's what your sound wave starts to look like. And then they take this and just push this up as loud as they can, right up against the distortion level, sometimes going over that. So you might say to yourself, why would they do that? Well, they do that because of the acoustic phenomenon of when something is louder, it gets your attention. Just like if you're sitting in a restaurant and somebody starts screaming, everybody turns around because all of a sudden, the whole level of the restaurant, everybody's talking, the chatter is at one level, and all of a sudden something jumps out way over the top of that. It gets everyone's attention. Think of it like when you're watching a movie. You're watching a movie, it's really quiet, let's say a horror movie, and then a bomb goes off. Or they go around a corner and the person screams, and all of a sudden it's been really quiet, and now all of a sudden it's really loud. Well, it gets your attention. It causes you to, whoa. So their logic is that the louder recordings, it's going to get people's attention. It's going to jump out of your stereo more. It's going to stand out above other recordings. And in the early days of CD remastering, this was maybe true to a certain extent, because the early CDs, when they made early CDs, they were not, the technology wasn't quite there to transfer analog to digital cleanly enough. So you had a lot of CDs that, and maybe you've experienced this with early CDs, where you had to go like, you keep turning it up and it's like you still can't hear it. You're turning it and it's barely going up in volume. Well, that's the opposite extreme of what's the phenomenon we're talking about here with the Loudness Wars. They were hissy and noisy, and a lot of times when recordings were made before CDs, the engineer would EQ it a certain way for the medium it was going to get pressed on. So if it was getting sent to vinyl, they knew that there were certain frequencies that needed to be boosted or cut so that the needle wouldn't jump out of the groove, or so it would sound good. And they made those adjustments. Cassettes was another thing. If you had too much high end, it got real hissy, so they may have cut some of that high end out. And when CDs came around, CDs were like looking at things through a microscope. And you could hear all these flaws in the recording, and depending on where the master tape came from, if they took the original a master that they had used to make the cassettes from. Well, guess what? They rolled off the high end because on cassettes it's so hissy. So you put that on a CD and it sounds dull. And in fact, if you look at early CDs, they will have stickers on them that are things on the cover that say something like, this recording will show the shortcomings of the original source, basically apologizing, like, look, this was taken from an analog tape. Analog tape is noisy, and the CD is so much frequency response on a CD. It's going to highlight. It's like shining a bright light on it. It's going to show up all the flaws in the recording. So in the early days of CDs, you had sort of the opposite problem. Then when they started figuring out, hey, we can jack up the volume on these things, it makes it jump out more. People pop it in the stereo in their car and it just comes blasting out and immediately gets people's attention, like, whoa, this is so big and strong sounding. Well, you say, okay, well, what's the problem with that? Well, the problem is that when you take the dynamic range away, it's the equivalent of somebody, go back to the shouting thing in a restaurant. It's like somebody shouting in a monotone at the same, just like over and over with no dynamics in their speech. When people speak, we have a natural dynamics. We accent certain words. I just did it right there. We don't speak in a monotone. It isn't a loud, flat, loud monotone, and that's kind of what these recordings are. So what happens is just like if you're trying to have a conversation with somebody and that person was yelling really loud, really fast the entire time, after a while you'd be like, oh, my ears. You wouldn't be able to take it. Another good example is people who type all in caps when they write something on the internet. All in caps with no punctuation. It is so hard to read it because after a while it feels like it fatigues your eyes. It's hard to keep track of where you are because there's no punctuation, and just all the capital letters, it's just fatiguing. It seems like it's shouting. Or going to your TV and turning the brightness control all the way up. Yeah, at first it might seem like, whoa, like I'm seeing things I didn't see before. It's so bright. Isn't that cool? But then after a while, it just wears your eyes down. It fatigues your eyes. Well, that's the same thing in a recording when there's no dynamic, when there's no difference between soft and loud. It is just like a jackhammer pummeling your ears, and it fatigues your ears. And then on top of it, what people started doing, once everybody started making the recordings louder and louder and louder, and this sort of reached a critical mass point, maybe like around the mid-2000s, then they started making everything brighter to make it jump out more, because higher frequencies make it jump out more. So you got these harsh, bright recordings that when you listen to them, here's the other effect of no dynamic range. What starts to happen is the stereo field starts to collapse. When you listen to a well-mastered, lots of dynamic range vinyl record or properly done CD, there's a lot of acoustical, stereophonic space. It's like the guitar's here, one guitar's there, the vocals are there, the bass is here, and there's things moving in and out. Well, when you lose the dynamics and everything gets cut, it starts to get plastered. Everything moves up front and collapses in. And I'll tell you how I discovered the Loudness Wars. This was back in the early 2000s. I started to make CDs of my vinyl records. I have an old CD player that allows me to plug RCA jacks into and burn onto a CDR. It's a little portable tape deck that I bought early on in CDs. And so I would plug my turntable right from the receiver into this CD player. And I was making these copies from the vinyl. And I was like, wow, when I was listening to these, I was like, man, there's so much it sounds like 3D depth or something. It just seemed like it was so much more open. And at the same time, I had gotten a program on my computer where I could take the record, burn it onto my CDR. I would load it into the computer into this program that could take out the pops and ticks. So I distinctly remember I made a copy of Iron Maiden's Number of the Beast this way. And it sounded great. I had it in my car. It was so punchy, so much like depth to it. The stereo separation was awesome. And then I noticed on this program that it had a thing that would allow me to crank the volume up, to turn the volume of the whole recording up. And I thought, oh, okay, because I had noticed that my professional CD copy of Number of the Beast was a fair bit louder than the vinyl CD that I had made from my vinyl. So I found this thing on the program. I thought, this is great. I can jack the volume way up. So I jacked the volume way up on Number of the Beast, my vinyl version, CD version of Number of the Beast, made from my vinyl copy. And as soon as I did that, I was like, man, this doesn't sound as good. And I was like, what? So what happened? All I did was make it like a lot louder, but I was like, it just doesn't, it was something about it that I was like, it just doesn't sound good. And right at the same time, I bought Rush's Vapor Trails. And I was talking to a friend, I'm a bass player and a bass player friend, and he was like, how's the bass playing on the record? And I said, you know, it's funny. It's like, I can sort of hear the bass, but I can't really like make out what it's doing. And at the time I thought, well, maybe it's because it seemed like there were a lot of guitar overdubs. And I thought I read an article where Geddy Lee said that he had done like sometimes two basses playing at the same time. And I said, maybe that's it. Like there's so many guitars and maybe there's a bunch of like, he overdubbed a whole bunch of bass guitars too. And I just can't hear it. And I couldn't figure out why. And I didn't like the album. And I remember saying to my friend, it's like, man, I listened to it and it's like, it almost gives me a headache. And then I started Googling it. And as soon as I started Googling it, like, why does Rush Vapor Trails hurt my ears? The Loudness Wars, the expression the Loudness Wars popped up. And that was how I discovered that, okay. And then I started reading about it and started understanding that this is what happens when you dynamically crush things. You make the CD real loud. It gets really plastered. You lose the stereo separation. That's why I couldn't distinguish what the bass was doing in Vapor Trails, because it was so plastered. It's like somebody up in your face just yelling. You know, it's like, you can't make out what they're saying. It's just like a sloppy mess. And that's the way that recording felt to me. And then it clicked to me why I didn't like my vinyl copy on the CD of Number of the Beast that I jacked the volume way up on, because I had crushed it in my own way. I had taken all the dynamics out of it. And then that's when I started to become hyper aware of dynamic range and the Loudness Wars. And being somebody that listens to a lot of vinyl, I was also like, for instance, Judas Priest, when they were putting out their remasters in the mid 2000s or so, I would listen to it and I was like, oh man, this is so bright. And it's like, where's the bass? Like, I remember thinking like British Steel had a nice warm bass, like in Grinder. And then I got to CD and it was so like harsh and metallic sounding, and the bass guitar just faded away, and no bass on the recording in general. And that's when I realized that it was the Loudness Wars. So, kind of a long explanation there of what this is, but that's what the Loudness Wars is, and dynamically crushing things, taking the dynamics away from something, and why that's a bad thing. Because again, it's like you're taking away the light and shade. It'd be like a movie where everything is bright white, super bright the whole time in a bright white room or something. It'd be fatiguing on your eyes. And when you don't have the differences in dynamic range, when you don't have this, it makes it sound really flat and lifeless. And unfortunately with CDs, it's become a thing where I was just talking to a friend today on Messenger, and I just said, I don't buy modern CDs anymore, because 99 out of 100 times, they're just fatiguing, harsh to my ears. They've got no punch, and especially when I spend my days listening to vinyl and listening to stuff from the 70s and the 80s, where this stuff just kicks and punches, man. The bass drum, when you have a full dynamic range recording, man, you listen to like Highway to Hell by AC/DC, and boom, bah, boom, ga, you know, those drums just punch right out. When the song, there's a great example of dynamic range, right? It's just guitar and drums in the beginning, and then the doom, 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 I'm on the high. It's like the whole song lifts up and gets louder, and that for me creates energy, and it's just like, wow, it draws you in, and there's just this great like up and down feel where things drop down and then they come punching out at you. And that just all gets lost when albums and when CDs are just crushed dynamically. Now, I'm going to do a whole nother video on is it worth buying modern vinyl, because that's a topic sort of related to this, but this is already running 20 minutes into this. I don't want to get into that right now. I will say this with CDs. If you want to research this more, Google Loudness Wars. And also, two things. You can go to a site called the Dynamic Range Database. You can type in any band, any album, and for the most part, it should be on there. And they will give you a dynamic range reading. Now, remember when I said that a typical classical recording could have 18 to 22 decibels of dynamic range? A recording from the 70s is going to probably have like 14 to 16. Well, a modern recording, metal recording, badly mastered, can sometimes only have 4 or 5 or 6 dBs of dynamic range. So that means it's like a recording from the 70s has 3 or 4 times the amount of dynamic range that a modern CD has. And they have a graph on there that'll show you that when the sound starts to get compromised, when you get into 8, 7, 6 dBs, you're starting to lose quality, serious quality on the recording. And this will let you know. You can see, like, even when I do buy CDs, I check there and make sure, okay, if I'm going to go back and buy an original CD, I make sure I get the ones that have the most dynamic range. And if I'm thinking of a new album, sometimes I'll check there, and if I see that it's just really harshly, dynamically crushed, I won't even buy it because I know that I'm not going to like it. Do these things change on vinyl? Topic for another video. But in the meantime, go to the Dynamic Range Database and research it a little, and you'll start to hear it to your ears. Find a CD that you have that has a lot of dynamic range, a higher number. Listen to that, then find a CD that you have that has a very low number, not a lot of dynamic range. Then listen to that back to each other, and you'll hear what I mean by the difference of things getting splattered, loud, fatiguing, harsh, and you'll hear the dynamic one being punchy, open, airy, more stereo separation. The other thing you can do is you can go to, it's called the Steve Hoffman Forum. Steve Hoffman was a producer, a mastering engineer, I should say. And that is a forum that they dive really deep, and they'll tell you if a recording, a vinyl record, how it's recorded, how the sound quality is, and dynamic ranges is a constant discussion there. Thankfully, in the last like 5-7 years, there's been a trend moving away from these super loud, compressed, harsh sounding albums. More bands and labels are realizing that there's something to having an album with a lot of dynamic range in it. Streaming is a big thing now, and honestly, Spotify, a lot of people set the audio normalization on Spotify, meaning everything is at the same volume, and song to song from different bands, and so it sort of negates, if your song is really loud, guess what, it's not going to come popping out of Spotify or the streaming service. Everything's going to be at the same level, and it's just going to expose how harsh and bad these dynamically crushed recordings sound. So people are slowly starting to move away from it, but unfortunately it's something that's still out there, and that's the reason why I'm somebody that's a big believer in analog and spend most of my time in the vinyl analog world. So, okay, there you go. This was kind of a long video. It was just off the top of my head. I've been meaning to talk about this for a long time. Let me know in the comments if you have questions on this topic. Let me know. I'll try to answer them. And let me know if you've had any experience with this. Are you aware of this? Is this something that you've noticed with certain modern CDs? What are your feelings on remastered CDs versus the originals, vinyl? You know, the whole dynamic range thing, and how you hear it and how it may have affected you. So, okay, leave a comment or a question down below. Until we see you again, and make sure you rock hard, ride free.